Okay, this is the video explaining how to do Lesson 9-8, Factor by Grouping. This is a method that we use when we have a polynomial with 4 terms, and we need to factor this, and we're going to factor it actually into 2 binomials, or 2 sets of parentheses with 2 terms in them, just like we did yesterday, but our answer is going to look a little more complicated. Okay, so let's start the notes. This is 9.8, factor by grouping. Okay, so I'm going to do an example on the side, and then over here I'm going to write down the steps. There are 3 steps to factor by grouping. Okay, so the first example is going to be 4n to the third plus 8n squared minus 5n minus 10. So we have 4 terms, and there's not a single greatest common factor that divides into all of those, so we're going to have to go with factor by grouping. So step 1, and I'm going to try and color code this for you. Step 1 is to split into 2 parts. So we're going to split our polynomial into 2 parts. And that's as simple as cut it in half. Okay, so we split it into 2. We're going to deal with this half first, and then we're going to deal with this half second. Okay, step 2 is now to look at each half. So I'm only going to deal with these 2 terms at a time. And I'm going to look for a greatest common factor that divides into both of these terms. So step 2 is to factor out a GCF from each half. Factor out a GCF, greatest common factor, from each half. Okay, so I'm looking at the first half here, and I'm trying to figure out what's the largest number that divides into 4 and into 8. Well, 4 is the biggest number that divides into 4 and into 8. And then what's the most number of n's that both of these terms have to give up? And that would be n squared. Because remember, we can't take more n's from something than it has to give. So 4n squared is the greatest common factor for the first 2 terms. So then we're going to write down what is left after we factor that out. So we're going to divide 4 by 4, and that's 1, so we don't need to write the 1. We had n to the third. We factored out n squared, so we had 3, took 2 of them out front. That left a single n behind. Plus 8 divided by 4 is 2. And both of these n's are now out front, so we can close that set of parentheses. Now we look at the second half. Start over. What's the greatest common factor for just these 2 terms? What's the biggest thing that you can divide into -5, or biggest number that divides into -5 and -10? And that's going to be a -5. So we're going to factor that out. There's no n's because the 10 doesn't have an n to give. So what's left? -5 divided by 5 is 1. We did not pull out any n's, so that n is left. -10 divided by -5 is a +2. Now look what happened. Both sets of these parentheses are exactly the same. That's what we needed to have happen. If this does not happen, either you did something wrong and you need to try again, or more likely, if these aren't the same, then this whole thing is not factorable. Okay, but I'm only going to give you something that's factorable, so these 2 have to come out to be the same. Okay, so now we're ready for step 3, and step 3 is basically now we're going to write our answer. So step 3 says we're going to take these 2 parts, and we're going to factor out the common parentheses. Okay, factor out the common parentheses. So see how these both have an n plus 2? Well, then I'm going to write that down as n plus 2. That's the common parentheses. That's one of our two final sets of parentheses. That's going to be our answer. And then the part that's the red in this example, the part that we pulled out, those get together to form the other set of parentheses. And that's it. Final answer, we are done. Okay? So let's do another one. Another example, number 2. So that was number 1, here's number 2. 5t to the 4th plus 20t to the 3rd plus 6t plus 24. Okay, let me scooch this up a little bit here so we can see it. Okay, step 1 is to cut it in half. Step 1, chop it in half. Okay, make sure, I know the lighting is a little bad on this, but make sure you can see that there's still a plus here in front of the 6. Okay, step 2, factor out the greatest common factor from each half. So I'm going to look at the first two terms. What is the largest number that divides into 5 and into 20? Well, that's going to be a 5. And what's the most t's that you can pull out of each part? Well, that's a t to the 3rd, because this one only has 3 to give. So that's t to the 3rd. Okay, then what's left? So 5 divided by 5 is 1. T to the 4th, we had 4 t's. We took 3 of them out front. We left a single t. Next term, 20 divided by 5 is a positive 4. And all 3 of those t's are now out front. That part's done. So now I'm going to look at the second part here. What is the greatest number that goes into 6 and into 24? Well, that's a positive 6. You need to make sure you put a plus 6, because this is going to go into our second set of parentheses when we write our answer. We need that symbol there of a plus. So we can't take any t's, so now we're going to divide. 6t divided by 6, so the 6 divided by 6 is 1, and we did not pull any t's, so the t stays there. 24 divided by 6 is a positive 4, close the parentheses. And look what happened again. We have a t plus 4 and a t plus 4, so we know that we factored this correctly so far, that these match. Step 3 is to factor out that common parentheses. So the t plus 4, it shares that the same for both of them, so that's part of the answer. And then the other part that we pulled out, that is the second set of parentheses. 5t to the 3rd, and this is why we need the plus, because we have to say plus 6. And there we go. That one is done. Okay, I'm going to do a couple more examples. In fact, I have 3 more examples I'm going to walk through with you. 2 of them are off the homework, so it's well worth sticking around and watching the video to get all of the problems, okay? Even though I know that these are on your notes that I copied for you. It still helps to pay attention to it, okay? Number 3. 25v to the 3rd plus 5v squared plus 30v plus 6. Okay, step 1, chop it in half. Step 2, factor out a greatest common factor from each half. So the largest number, I'm looking at the 25 and the 5, the largest number that goes into 25 and 5 is 5. And then how many v's can we pull out? Well, this last one is the smallest number. We can only pull 2 out of there. So what's left? 25 divided by 5 is 5. I had 3 v's. 2 came out front. That left 1 v behind. Now let's divide the second part. 5 divided by 5 is 1. But all the v's are out front, so I actually have to put the plus 1 in this case because I need to hold that spot. Basically, we're thinking about 5v squared divided by 5v squared, and that's 1. Close the parentheses. Okay, so there's the first half. Now let's look at the second half. Largest number that divides into 30 and 6, well, that's a positive 6 again. And let's divide. No v's because the 6 doesn't have a v to give. So 30v, 30 divided by 6 is 5. We didn't pull out any v's, so v is left. 6 divided by 6 is 1. We need to hold the place with the plus 1. Once again, look at, we've got matching sets of parentheses. So with those matching sets of parentheses, that becomes one of the parentheses in the final answer. And then what we pulled out, the 5v squared plus 6, is the other set of parentheses. There we go. By the way, this was number 7 on the homework. Number 7. Okay. I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to do another one. So I'm going to do 2 more, okay? So let's do another piece of paper. It's on the back of your notes. You've got your notes. They're on the back of it, okay? So this is number 4. My marker just bled through, so that's why I'm using a different piece of paper. 6n to the third plus 8n squared plus 3n plus 4. Right? Step 1, chop it in half. Step 2, factor out a greatest common factor of each half. So biggest number that divides into 6 and 8 is 2. Largest number n's you can take from both of those, or divide out from both of them, is n squared. So now we're going to divide. 6 divided by 2 is 3. I had n to the third. 2 of them came out front. That leaves a single n behind. Next term. 8 divided by 2 is a positive 4. Both of these n's are out front. Close the set of parentheses. Next, 3n plus 4. There's not a number that divides into both of those. And there's not an n that you can pull out of both of those. So when this happens, I actually need to pretend, or I need to show that I'm dividing something out. So the only number really that divides into 3 and 4 is a positive 1. And if I do that, I get 3n divided by 1 is 3n. 4 divided by 1 is a positive 4. I had to do that so I got my matching parentheses. And I also needed to put the 1 down so that I had something else to join the 2n squared in a set of parentheses. So our final answer, remember, shared parentheses goes out front. And then what you pulled out, the other 2 terms that came out of each half, get that second set of parentheses. Final answer. Okay, so that's what happens when you can't really factor anything out of one of these. You have to put a plus 1. All right, one last one, and it looks really ugly, but it's one from your homework, and it's actually not too bad. So last problem I'm going to do with you. 5a squared z minus 4a squared c plus 15x z minus 12x c. That looks really complicated, but just take it piece by piece. It'll be all right. So first step, chop it in half. Now we're only dealing with 2 terms at a time. So greatest common factor, step 2. What's the biggest number that divides into 5 and 4? There isn't one, so let's look at the variables. What's the most, okay, we've got A's, Z's, and C's. Let's start with the A's. Is there something that I share that I can pull out of both of these? Well, they both have an a squared, so I can pull out an a squared from both of those terms, and that's it. That's the only thing they share. So I'm going to pull out the a squared. That means I'm left with the 5 and the z behind.